Hi everyone, we're gonna present Black Revolutionaries. Black history is American history, presented by Zizo, Sandra, Alexis, and Abigail. Myself.
So hello everyone, I am Sandra, and my group members and I decided to focus on the Black Lives Matter movement, but more specifically on how the movement began by looking at history. This is important to me because in order to understand um, the movement and begin discussing it, we have to understand history, and understanding history will give people a better understanding on why America began and why America is the way it is today. So the United States, but also globally, they don't acknowledge that America is the way it is today because of the work Black people did. It's also important because justice and police brutality is something that we continue fighting for, and using our voice as supporters of the movement will help continue create change for the Black community. I think the history of how it all began was left out because history courses don't really give students a full picture of history, and they just choose specific moments in history that students will learn about. So, for some context of Black history, in August of 1619, a ship that was carrying 20 enslaved African people appeared near the coastal port in the British colony of Virginia, and this is how the history of America began. History is also acknowledged from the white point of view, and many historical important events are left out. So, uh, but it's also known that a big part of history is racism, and racism is being prejudiced and having structural power. So, uh, race wasn't a thing, but race was created as a social construct because before like people were enslaved, race wasn't a thing, and people had their own tribes and groups. But once Europeans came to enslave people, they put people into one single category, and then that's when they decided who was on the top and who was on the bottom, and they dehumanized anyone who didn't fit the standard of white people. It is known that Black people experienced the most inhumane things during slavery because they were forced to do many things for white people. During slavery, African uh, people weren't allowed to marry, they weren't allowed to meet in groups, learn how to read, write, vote. They were tortured, raped, and millions of them died, including on ships. They also taught colonists how to grow rice. They paid off war debts and like prestigious universities. Things like speech, music, fashion, and hair have a connection to slavery. Black people did so many things for America, yet there is still not much acknowledgement for it. So something else is that like the reason why capitalism in the U.S. and Britain, along with other countries, are what they are today is because of slavery and genocide. And something people don't know is that over 75% of like the world's resources are in Africa. So another thing is that Black people were only allowed to fight in the military because they didn't have enough white people to do it for them. But then later on, progress was made because more than 600 Black men served in the legislators and more served in like local positions. So then they were able to create change, and later on, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were created. So these amendments were supposed to like create change and protect people, but even after these amendments were created, they were still being treated horribly. Black people continue to face systemic oppression, racism, bias, and discrimination while also having to work twice as hard. So today, Black Americans have made amazing progress, but not only for themselves, but they have inspired other movements by creating their own movements. And so that was a little bit of context. So now I will talk about the Black Panthers. And the Black Panther Party was a movement. Oh, well, the Black Panther Party was before the Black Lives Matter movement. So the Black Panther Party was a political organization that challenged police brutality against the African American community. So the initial cause of the formation of the Black Panther Party was in response to police brutality happening around them, and like nothing being done about it to help them. So the movement was founded by college students Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California in the year of 1966. So many Americans saw the Black Panther Party as a violent, like armed group, and some didn't take it seriously, but they were creating change like for their community. And the Black Panther Party also stood up for other causes such as like the free breakfast program, affordable housing, and education.
In the image, we can see how they were the Black Panthers movement helped the community of black people by giving them groceries and helping them on their basic needs, which was not seen as much because they were breaking up the injustice towards black people. And this pamphlet was from the Black Panthers Pantries by Angela Davis Peoples, which offer free food programs from March 29 to 31 in 1972 on Oakland, California.
All right, so what's up, guys? I'm Zizo, as you know, and I'm going to be reading the chapter on the Black Lives Matter movement. So, the Black Lives Matter movement, which is often abbreviated as BLM, is a political and social movement with the goal of highlighting racism and inequality towards Black people, kind of similar to the previously mentioned Black Panthers. So this organization, or this movement, I should say, originated in 2013, which was formed as a response of the acquittal of George Zimmerman after he viciously murdered Trayvon Martin. Shia Garza is actually credited with creating the term Black Lives Matter when she made a Twitter post titled hashtag Black Lives Matter. So this movement is unique in its use of social media to create change, and I would say how the media perceives them compared to the Black Panthers. I think Black Lives Matter is in a unique position where they really understood how to use their resources to create, support for their movement and their overall idea behind it. And Black Lives Matter has actually organized many national protests and taken action. And I want to highlight the following three events as being major influences to the movement. So the first one is the killing of Eric Garner. Eric Garner was an unarmed Black man who was killed in 2014 after a police officer put him into a chokehold. His infamous last words were, "I can't breathe." And I think Eric Garner is not mentioned as much due to the fact that it happened, in 2014, which was, out of people's minds because it's not as recent as some of the other events that happened. But I think he was one of the important catalysts for this movement because you see a lot of people going in the streets holding signs saying, "I can't breathe," or saying, "I can't breathe" as a form of protest to the police. And this is due to what happened with Eric Garner. And this phrase, "I can't breathe," comes up later on again. And after he was murdered, there were public protests, obviously. The second major event was the Breonna Taylor home invasion. On March 13, 2020, police officers forcefully entered Breonna Taylor's home at midnight with a no-knock warrant. A no-knock warrant allows a police officer, as long as they have a court order, to forcefully enter someone's home without notifying them. So typically, when you have a warrant, you would knock on the door, ring the doorbell to allow the person to know that you're coming. With a no-knock, that's out the door. You just ran through the door and you're in. Uh, this obviously started Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend at the time, Kenneth Walker. So Walker had a registered firearm and he shot at what he believed to be intruders, right? Because it's the middle of the night and people have broken into your home. So he shot at the intruders, which were the police, and then the police shot back at him, firing a barrage of bullets. Unfortunately, the victim of the situation was Breonna Taylor, who was sleeping in her home. So it wasn't even safe to be in your safe place, your house, to be sleeping in a vulnerable position without somebody, coming in and basically killing you. And After this, the Black Lives Matter movement called for criminal charges towards the officers involved. So you could kind of see the movement overall coming in and trying to, advocate for these Black people who were in these situations where they were oppressed by law enforcement or, even murdered in these two cases. Finally, the murder of George Floyd. George Floyd entered a local grocery store to purchase cigarettes on May 25, 2020. As he exited the store owner accused him of using counterfeit money and subsequently called the police. So he paid for his items, but the store owner thought it was a fake 20 or something like that. The police then confront Floyd and handcuff him on the ground as more officers arrived on the scene. Officer Derek Chauvin then held down, pressing his knee on Floyd's neck. So Floyd was already on the ground. He now added more to that by pressing his knee down on his neck right here. And Floyd pleaded with him, echoing the same words as Garner said. And if you remember, that was, "I can't breathe." So now he's informed the officer who has his knee on his neck that he cannot breathe. And Chauvin just completely disregarded that. He kept his knee there. It was as if nothing was going on in Chauvin's mind. And eventually, Floyd ended up dying. And this was a huge, huge situation. And due to the power of social media, it was recorded by a bystander and it spread all across the world. And the world erupted. They went insane. They were not happy. They could not stand what just happened. And there were massive protests, like crazy protests in every major city. I think even in the UK, there were protests, and they're not even from the US. So that just tells you the scope of the event. And the Black Lives Matter movement led many of these huge protests. And luckily, Chauvin was fired and he's now paying for his crimes with a 22.5 year sentence. Um, in addition to chokeholds, being banned or restricted in 17 legislators. So it's unfortunate what happened to George Floyd for us to get to this level of holding these people accountable. These are the three most influential situations that really form the Black Lives Matter movement. If somebody wanted to learn about this movement, I would refer to them to these three situations. All right. Thank you. I'm going to go pass this on to the next presenter.
The Black Panthers paved the road for many revolutionary groups and thinkers as the Black Lives Matter movement. However, there are some key differences between the way these two groups operate. Black Lives Matter operates more on the ground level, with multiple local leaders in different cities rather than following a few central leaders of the movement, which makes the movement more sustainable in the long run, unlike the Black Panthers who had key leaders and most of them were men. Then, when these leaders were forced out of the country or killed, the party started to fall apart. So the local leaders around the country start their own organizations to help fight systemic racism in the U.S. Now, BLM is starting to organize a bit more and create more local Black political power. By creating community power, we can collectively acknowledge the critical role that Black lives and struggles for Black liberation have played in inspiring and anchoring through practice and theory social movements for the liberation of all people.
Now, to conclude, history trained people to believe in the system where Black people are inferior to every other person, which is a problem because it affects Black community and causes harm, leading to a society full of hatred. We have heard of the injustice that Black people have experienced, but have you, an individual, reflect on what you actually know about history? Do you learn something new throughout this chapter? Did you reflect on your privilege? Schools reach us many events in history, but most are seen and graded from white perspectives, making individuals at young age learn inaccurate, important historical facts.
And so Black people are targets of prejudice, systemic discrimination, microaggressions, police brutality, high incarceration rates, and physical acts of violence. Racism is the connection to the United States, and if we as a nation want to put in the effort to learn and change, we must acknowledge history in order for that change to actually happen. We must say the names of those who lost their lives to police brutality and the acts of violence against them simply because they are Black and just existing. This all should be included in the dominant historical narrative, because people, supporters, activists need to know how it all began. They need to know the history. The story of Black people has been left out of this country and what they have done for this country, and they have influenced many things, and people steal or appropriate and profit off of them while giving no credit to them. Through learning accurate historical information, communities who are oppressed can learn more information, and the oppressing groups can reflect on their privilege and listen to the voices of those who want change. Thank you.
So, what did creating the textbook entry teach you about understanding history? I think creating this textbook entry with my group really taught me that it's important to do our own research, and it's important to realize where our sources come from and double check with each other. And it made me a better critical thinker, for sure. What things surprised you in your group about researching the topic? Some things that surprised me was just how deep the Black Panthers history went, because I never really was taught any of this during my younger years until I was in college, and how, like, there can be a whole textbook on Black liberation if we really wanted to. So yeah, I think what surprised me was just how far this history goes, because we could talk so much more about it.
Okay, so my main takeaway, and why I think this is important to learn about, is because as we've been reading through this, textbook, we can notice that there's a constant theme of power and abuse of power in particular. So I'm not saying all law enforcement abuses power, but the ones that do need to be held accountable. And it shouldn't be taking, the lives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner for us to realize this. We should be doing this proactively and not reactionary to a situation that already happened. So, yeah, I think that's going to be my main takeaway moving forward. Thank you so much.
What surprised me the most when creating this book was that we still have things that we've seen in the past in history, and a lot of things that we've seen in the past in history we learn in ourselves, or I learned them just in college, because during your early years on school they don't really teach you about the ways of racism and how it is in today's days. So that's the thing that surprised me the most, that we still have like these ideas of the systems where we see people in lower incomes being mainly people of colors or immigrants, and as we see in today's, or like this chapter, it's that people of color have been suffering from like a lot of from the past, since the past. And I think that it's just surprising how we haven't really improved to welcome them and make the opportunities more equal to everyone, especially with the Black people, because they've been treated as victims, or like predators and victims from police brutality and the government with the laws and everything they do. It hasn't really changed, and then we can see it from like the past year and how Black Lives Movement grew a lot on like the past year, where like no one really knew about it, and then now that everyone does, that's just what impacts me. I think that we should include this narrative in the US historical narrative because it shows how African Americans or Black people or a community of color which are really standing out are being treated as bad people and people who is dangerous, but it's not really always that case, and we don't really see it as much. And if we do, it's mainly because the government hasn't created policies that support them, and that they only get pushed down to do the things that they need to do to leave. Because it's not that they want to do bad things, it's that they don't have the resources or opportunities that people that are criticizing them have. So I think that's why we should include this narrative into the US historical narrative. The way they will be benefit is that they will get resources, and therefore there will be less crime, and then we will have less stereotypes of Black people as bad people, because they are not. Just like immigrants too, who are like being oppressed by the system of US to do really bad jobs, and where they have to survive and do really hard labor work. And I think if we added this US historical to the narrative, then this will create more opportunities, and there would therefore be less stress, and there will be less crime, because they won't have to do anything of that to get the money or benefits to sustain themselves. And also they will have more rights, and people won't just assume that they are criminals and kill them because they're suspicious, because the stereotypes would not be there. Also, that way I think the US will be more equitable, or I think that if we create more opportunities for everyone, we're not just people who has education and other things can work jobs that are not killing them or making them do hard labor work. It would be really more equitable for them, and to know that they don't really have the resources to go to school after, or maybe they can because they don't have the papers, or they don't have the right knowledge or information because their parents were never home, or because their parents die, or I don't know. There's like so many circumstances where we should be able to give them the opportunities they deserve.